Welcome to Have a Life Teaching, the podcast designed for educators who are dedicated to enhancing their teaching practice and creating a positive impact on their students' lives. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the world of education, exploring a wide range of topics related to curriculum, instruction, and assessment in K-12 schools. Together, we'll learn from the brightest minds in the education field. So if you're a passionate educator who's ready to take your teaching practice to the next level, join us as we explore the exciting world of education. My name is John Shimbari, signing in and saying, let's have a life teaching. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Have a Life Teaching podcast. My name is John Shimbari, your host. And one topic that I think it's important that we discuss today is the topic around sustainability of teaching. So we all know for a variety of reasons that many teachers are opting to leave the classroom. With this in mind, though, how do we still ensure that we have qualified, capable teachers teaching our students? How do we perhaps think about what we're asking teachers to do and how we're asking them to do it as a way to consider how to make the profession a little bit more sustainable? With that in mind, I'm really excited today to be joined by my next guest, Paul Emerich France. He is a national board certified teacher, coach, and author of the brand new book, Make Teaching Sustainable, which is also the title of the consulting organization that he has founded. So, Paul, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I'm glad to have you. So, Paul, to get things started, I like to ask my guests how you got, maybe even not so much into education, but how did sustainable practice in the teaching profession become a particular interest of yours?
To oversimplify the answer, teaching is unsustainable for so many, right? It's a pervasive problem. Burnout's a problem. There has been this exodus of teachers, especially since 2020. I think the pandemic sort of brought into an even brighter light the degree to which teachers are burning out. It sort of amplified a lot of the problems that we were already seeing, and people started talking about them more. For me personally, that was part of it, but also the swift transition to distance learning in 2020, it helped me see that some of my colleagues actually were engaging in a lot of unsustainable practices. And I saw that because the shift from in-person learning to distance learning for me was actually pretty smooth. But what I noticed was that some teachers were trying to replicate these practices that they did in person virtually, and it made their jobs a lot harder. So for instance, right, like hovering over kids and having to tell them what to do constantly, right? Like that is something that a lot of elementary school teachers feel they have to do because, sure, it comes from a lot of different places. One, I think, they have great intentions and they want their kids to succeed. I think some of it is that they're afraid to let the kids fail, or they're afraid for the kids to fail. And I think a lot of the system, the education system incentivizes this type of teaching because it's so high stakes, right? High stakes testing creates all this anxiety in teachers. But so my teaching online, moving to distance learning was not that challenging because I was already operating in such a way where my kids had a lot of independence and had a lot of agency, and they knew how to operate on their own. And so that's where the idea of sustainability really came from, that okay, I found some sustainable practices that I can do in person and I can do virtually. And so I decided to start writing about it. And I pitched the idea to ASCD. And of course, obviously they liked it because now the book is published through ASCD.
Congratulations, by the way.
Thank you. But as I started writing it, I realized it was kind of misguided for me to write a book on sustainability entirely through my perspective. Because as we all do, right? I have biases. I'm a younger white male teacher who's taught in mostly affluent schools, and that needs to be named. And so my perspective on sustainability is not going to apply to everyone. And so I saw it as an opportunity. It was a challenge, but I saw it as an opportunity to talk to other teachers about what is unsustainable for them. And so this turned into the Sustainable Teaching Project. And through that, I collected over 300 survey responses and then conducted over 40 hours of interviews. I got responses from teachers in all 50 states. And I found that people were just kind of chomping at the bit to talk to me about sustainability, because I think what you see in our profession, right, is that people are very passionate teachers are very passionate about what they do, right? You don't go into teaching for the money or the glory or anything like that. You go into it because you're interested in it and you want to help kids. And, there's something about it that fascinates you. And the system, the unsustainable policies and practices within our system just sort of chip away at teachers' resilience over time, right? And to the point where many go, I've had it. I'm not doing this anymore.
Exactly.
And so that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to gather those stories, synthesize them into something so we can start having more conversations about sustainability and encouraging teachers and admins and coaches to identify unsustainable practices in their schools and make incremental shifts to continuously work towards sustainability.
You've had this amazing opportunity to survey so many teachers across, like you said, all 50 states. Could you synthesize what some of those common challenges are for teachers? Like, what exactly is the unsustainable in our profession? And then we could possibly talk about some strategies to help teachers through those things that we're currently finding unsustainable.
Yeah, it sounds like you're asking what are some of the key takeaways from what makes teaching unsustainable?
Correct.
Yeah. I mean, the first thing is workload. I mean, that's obvious, right? Teachers just have so many responsibilities, and there's not enough time in the day to do all of those things. Some of those things are outside of teachers' control, but some of those things are, in my opinion, and again, this differs depending on the school and the district and what the constraints are and what they're being asked to do. But there are some things that teachers do that are unsustainable that they actually can change. And I think one of the big things that continuously comes up is grading. And teachers say, well, I have so much to grade. I have so many things to take home. It's like, okay, well, let's talk about grading. Let's talk about the difference between grading and assessment, because I think those are two. I mean, they are objectively two different words, and they're two different words because they mean two very different things. I know from personal experience, my own journey with grading and assessment, that when I started teaching, I was engaging in like that traditional grading, right? Where it's like you give out assignments, you assign point totals, you give them a score based on how much they completed or how correct they are. You log them all in the grade book. And it was within the first 2 years of teaching for me, I realized that this just wasn't actually doing anything for me. I remember parents reach out to me about their son. And this boy was very, very eccentric, very bright, very inquisitive. And his standardized test scores were pretty high, but his grades in class were low, because like he wasn't completing things, he was not paying attention to certain things. And the point is, I was so caught up in the point totals and all that stuff that I was missing what he really needed, which was like executive functioning work and things outside of what we would typically, put into a grade, like correctness or completion. And so that prompted a shift in my practice where like I stopped assigning point totals to things, and I started to take a more standards-based approach where I was actually qualifying, this is what I want kids to know and be able to do, and then bringing them into that. This is what we're learning in this unit. Here's a student-friendly rubric for this. And so in my opinion, that is far more sustainable than doing the whole point total thing, because not only is it focused on what actually matters in terms of assessment, but it's also sharing the energy demands of assessment with kids.
So, Paul, I love that, because I don't know if you've had a chance to look or listen to any of the other episodes, but recently I had Star Saxene on the show. Yeah. And she was talking about her work in assessment. And so it's really exciting to me to hear the alignment between what she was talking about and what you're talking about. And I think the clear takeaway is the difference between grading and assessment. And one way we could definitely make this profession a little bit more sustainable is to be more strategic in what we grade what we don't grade, how we grade versus how we assess. So to your point, if you're sharing that rubric with students and involving students in helping you to assess themselves, that's still very valuable work. In fact, one might even argue that's even more valuable than assigning points because the students are vested in that process.
I mean, the other thing with that too is then you can also do that in class, right? So you're using your time during the school day to do the assessment, and you're doing it with kids. And so it's actually good for kids, but it's also good for teachers. And for me, that's at the heart of sustainable teaching, is that they're practices that are good for kids, because this isn't about just having teachers do less work. This is about having teachers work smarter, right? And do things that are good for kids, but also good for them. And so in that instance, or in those instances, right, where you're sharing that demands of assessment with kids, you're actually embedding assessment into the learning block. And therefore, you don't have to do that on the weekend, or you do less on the weekend. And I know for me as an elementary school person, right, like another thing I used to do, the kids would, in elementary school, we teach all the subjects. So we teach writing. So I hear this, from English teachers in middle and high school too. It's like, oh, there's so many essays and I've got to write all these comments. It's like, do you have to write all those comments? Or there's some of them you don't need to write? Because what I would do is I would take their drafts and I would write it all over them and do all this. I'd hand them back to them. And fourth graders are like, okay. They just don't process the feedback, right? So I'm putting all of this work into doing this. And it was because, that was how I grew up. That was what I knew to be good teaching. And I realized, actually, wait a second, I need to change the way that I'm teaching in class and do more small group conferencing or individual conferencing, and just provide verbal feedback in the classroom. And then I don't have to write those comments on the weekends that they're not going to read and process and internalize anyway. And that's the whole point of assessment, right? The whole point of assessment is that we're helping kids see where their strengths and where their challenges lie so that they can initiate improvements to their work. So why do that on the weekend if it's ineffective? And instead, it seems like a more logical choice to just change the way I structure my learning block, embed the assessment into the learning block. The kids get a short feedback loop and can fix it right away. And then I'm not doing work on the weekends. I have vivid memories of sitting at Starbucks and spilling my coffee all over the papers and everything. And, and it's not to say, right, I don't want to paint this with such a broad brush that it oversimplifies it. Like, it's not to say that sometimes you might not take some work home, right? But it's about reducing it, and there are certain things that, in elementary school, it's like you do have to give some paper pencil assessments. You need summative assessments, and like you need that data. It's just that you don't have to do it every week, right? You could do it once a month, and then you're able to sort of pace yourself. It's like a pacing of yourself, right? And it's a reprioritization.
What else would you suggest could be a hack for teachers to make this profession just a tad bit more sustainable?
Well, I think another area is lesson planning. I speak about these things from experience, having done these things and having experienced just how unsustainable they are.
Me too.
Like I remember my first years of teaching, even that first couple weeks, where like, I got out my plan book and I wrote everything in like my perfect little cursive, and I was like so excited to have my plan book all ready for the first weeks of school. And I get in there, 21-year-old Paul closes the door and is like, oh my gosh, they trusted me with 25 fourth graders. What am I going to do? Within a half hour, I was like, oh, none of these plans are relevant anymore, because I'm realizing this and this and this and this and this, right? Now, obviously, with time and with experience, you learn to anticipate things better. But I think a lot of times the ways that we ask teachers to plan are unsustainable in themselves. Like I've been an adjunct at a university. Part of the curriculum, right, asked teachers to plan. So I taught a social studies methods course, and the lesson plan that the university gave me to use, I looked at it and I went, this is not realistic. Like, 6-stage lesson plan for one lesson. Who has time to do that? No one. Exactly. And the thing is, right, that was at a university, but this kind of stuff happens in schools, right, where teachers are asked to do these really outlandish lesson plans. And I understand that we want teachers to think through their lessons. I think that's really important, but it's just not sustainable, right? So like if it's not sustainable and teachers can't keep that up, and of course also, right, that means that when they're writing that 6-page lesson plan, it's taking time away from them doing something else that's probably more important. And a lot of times those types of lesson plans are grounded more in compliance than they are in actually ensuring good teaching. And so I think lesson planning is really important, but I think taking a minimalist approach to lesson planning is the more sustainable way to go. And I write about that in the book. And there's a chapter called Minimalism Over Maximalism. And it's really about simplifying lesson planning. I actually like to think of planning in terms of units as opposed to individual lessons, because it's more embodied, right? Like it's like everything sort of fits together. I think also, right, it's a matter of finding rituals or finding lesson structures that you can replicate. So I'm a big fan of the workshop model. I'm a big fan of complex instruction because it's actually a simpler way to plan. You find an open-ended task, you teach kids ways to journal about their learning, and you foster discussion in the class. It's one of those things where when you start doing that, when you start embracing that way of teaching, it is a little bit more work at first. But now that I've been doing it for so long, it's like, and now that I've taught so many grades, my planning is just so simple because I know what I'm doing. I know what to expect. I know what to anticipate, right? I don't have to write a 6-page lesson plan. And I think like there's an element here of accountability that I empathize with. I think sometimes accountability is more so grounded in wanting to like make sure we control what teachers are doing as opposed to really supporting teachers. And my stance is, hey, if you want transparency into planning, go join a planning meeting and sit with teachers and talk through their plans with them. Go observe in their classrooms and be like a participant observer and look at the effectiveness of their teaching. And if things seem ineffective, then you join the planning meeting. You talk about like, yeah, how did you plan for that? Like, I thought that this was clunky, but just having teachers submit their lesson plans, it's just, and the other thing too, right? Principals don't have time to read all those. So you're asking teachers to submit all these, knowing that you don't have time to read them. And so you're really just creating busy work for teachers and wasting their time. It's just, I think there are other ways to get insight into how teachers are planning other than just collecting everything they write. The things we ask teachers to do should serve an authentic purpose. And at the end of the day, right, what's the point of lesson planning? The point of lesson planning is to make sure we're effective teachers, right? So what's the best way to find out if someone's an effective teacher? Go in their classroom and watch them teach, like that to me seems like the more authentic assessment of teaching, not the plan itself. Because I think also too, when you create a system in which you're asking teachers to submit lesson plans for compliance purposes, then teachers engage in that practice of submitting lesson plans for compliance. Like they engage in it in such a way that's just being compliant, right? They mindlessly write them. Ever since I wrote that ASCD article, I've gotten like DMs and just comments, or replies to tweets and stuff. And people are like, yeah, I just kind of copied and pasted stuff from last year and just turned it in just to get it done. It's like, how is that helping anybody? And that's the thing, right? Compliance-based practices incentivize behavior like that. Authentic practices grounded in, actually trying to teach better, teach more deeply, that's going to get that. Authentic practices like going in and observing, being a participant, helping with the planning process, like those are the things that are actually going to enrich planning and help teachers reach more kids, in my opinion.
Are there any other areas where you find there could be a tune-up in terms of making the profession a little bit more sustainable?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of related to what we were just talking about, but what came through time and time and time and time and time again was this idea of teacher agency and like dignity in the profession, right? The teachers feel controlled, they feel micromanaged, they feel like they don't have autonomy. And this is not a pedagogical thing, right? This is a cultural thing. And if you think about the impact, right, of not having autonomy, of feeling not trusted, it chips away at you over time. And we can think about it from an emotional perspective, right? I think we've all felt, most of us, right, have felt that way before. When someone manipulates or controls us or just tells us what to do, we just are like, do you even trust me? Like, and it takes an emotional toll on you. But we can also look at research on intrinsic motivation. And I always go back to Daniel Pink's definition of intrinsic motivation. He defines it in terms of autonomy, mastery, and purpose. So purpose is just like, do I know why I'm doing what I'm doing? Even if I don't want to do it, do I know why I'm doing it? And that might motivate me to do whatever thing I need to do. There's a sense of mastery. Mastery is not, I check the box and I'm perfect at it, but mastery is a sense. So mastery is, I can connect my efforts to tangible progress. I see that the work I'm putting in is actually leading to something. In the case of teaching, right? I can see that, learning how to implement project-based learning is actually creating richer experiences for my kids, even though it's a lot of work at the outset, right? Or shifting my grading practices from points to standards-based. Like, it's a lot of work right now, but I can see that it's making my kids more aware of what they're learning, and it's leading to deeper thinking. So there's I said purpose, mastery, and then there's autonomy. Autonomy doesn't mean you do whatever you want. Autonomy just means I have the capacity to make decisions within agreed upon or co-constructed boundaries at the school, which is why I think that consensus is super important at schools. Like, it's super important that teachers have a voice in how the school is run. And I think the principal's job should not be to make all the decisions, but instead to be a steward of this kind of collectivist way of running a school, where like teachers have voice in how things work. And so that idea of autonomy came through just so much. The teachers just feel run down and micromanaged and not trusted, to the point where they're like, fine, forget it. I'm not gonna try and solve problems on my own. Just tell me what to do and I'll just do it. And then they, it just causes them, it builds resentment. It causes them to disengage. And it's, at the end of the day, teachers go into teaching because they're interested in it, right? And when you're already not getting paid well, and you have someone that's just trying to control everything you do, it's like, what's the point of doing this? Why am I here? I could go work, somewhere else. I could go work in a restaurant. I could go work somewhere else and probably make the same amount of money and work way less. So why am I staying in teaching if I can't just be a teacher? We need teachers to be decision makers, right? Because we need them to be able to make decisions in the moment based on what they've learned. I think the thing is, people don't do that sometimes, though, because they're afraid like the teacher's going to make the wrong decision and then waste time. And it's like, I get that. And in some schools, it's really urgent, right? There's a lot of urgency around improving test scores or just improving the way teachers teach. But it's just not sustainable because it doesn't actually build capacity in the long run. And then all of the decision making is centralized in like your coaches or your administrators. And that's just too much for a handful of people to do. We need everybody to be mindful decision makers who feel like, empowered and feel confident to just try and figure things out.
What would you say, Paul? Are there any areas or anything about sustainability that we haven't talked about?
Yeah. I mean, there's so much. I guess I'm thinking through. So the book is structured in 6 mindset shifts: humanity over industry, collectivism over individualism, empowerment over control. We've discussed collectivism a little bit. We've discussed empowerment a little bit. There's minimalism over maximalism, which is the lesson planning chapter. There's process over product, which is really an assessment chapter and like shifting towards learner-driven assessment, standards-based assessment, that sort of thing. And the last is flexibility over fixedness, which is like responsive instruction. So I guess that of all of those 6 mindset shifts, the one that we haven't really touched on is humanity over industry. I put it first in the book for a reason. That chapter really focuses on humanizing teaching. So that's partially related to making academics or just making what kids are learning meaningful and relevant to them. So like a really concrete example is like stories. I remember asking my 3rd grade class, why do you think I want you to know about stories? And they were like, because it's going to be on the test. And I was like, no, like, that's not why. I mean, do I want you to be prepared for the test? Sure. But like, I think stories are important because people have been telling stories for thousands of years, right? People tell stories to build community. They tell stories to pass on wisdom, generational wisdom, right? The stories have inherent meaning in the history of humanity, right? Like, that's why I want you to know stories. And stories are going to be relevant to your lives. You learn through stories all the time. You learn when you watch a TV show, you learn when you read a book, you learn when you go to the movies and there's a lesson in the movie, like, that's all stories. This is important on a human level. And we lose that in the education system. And it's mostly due to the fact that mostly due to the way we use standardized assessment, right? It's all about getting that score and answering the question correctly. And it really waters down what we're actually trying to do, what our collective goals for education actually should be. So that's part of humanizing. But the other part is just understanding identity, right? And understanding how identity impacts sustainability in schools. And I'm gay. I'm a gay teacher. And I know what it's like to work in a school where my identity wasn't safe and celebrated in the same ways that like all the straight teachers' identities were. And similar to the conversation we had about agency and autonomy, right? Feeling like you don't belong or feeling like who you are isn't welcome in a school is going to make you disengage. And I hope the intersection between sustainability and disengagement is clear. But it's like, if I'm not feeling like I'm comfortable to engage, like, it's not going to be sustainable for me. It's just going to chip away at me over time. And I'm also not going to be able to contribute, right? Like, I'm going to be kind of just a person in the background, not contributing to the collective goals of the school because I don't feel like I belong. So that's like one area I feel like we didn't really touch on, but I'm very, very passionate about, because at the end of the day, in order for teaching to be sustainable, we need everybody who walks in those doors of the school to be sharing in the energy demands of learning. And learning is very demanding, right? So we want everybody engaged. We want everybody in. And if we don't create inclusive spaces for everybody to feel like they belong, we will not have everybody in, and we will be dragging people along. It just doesn't work.
How do you recommend teachers carve out space for themselves to be who they are in a safe way if that's not being done by their administration?
I think it takes a really clear understanding of where the boundaries are and doing everything you can within those boundaries,
And that's part of the problem, right, Paul? A lot of educators don't know where those boundaries are right now.
Yeah, no, it's totally a problem. I mean, all I can do is speak from my experience, and like, I left my first job because I was like, I'm not safe here. And I wouldn't blame anybody who does the same thing, I think it's that this is where it becomes so personal, right? Everybody has different thresholds for what they can tolerate and what they're willing to tolerate. I think one thing that helps is probably identifying a goal for yourself. Like, why am I here? What am I doing here? What am I trying to accomplish? Can I accomplish that here? I think some queer teachers would say, well, I'm going to make some sacrifices because I want to be here and to be a queer role model that will, so that any queer students here see that I'm here. Because sometimes just existing in the space and kids kind of knowing, without it being said explicitly, is helpful, right? And I think some people are able to see that and then hold that and also weather it. I was not able to do that in my first job. I think now I have a higher tolerance. I know more now. I've been through more now. So like, I can hold some of that discomfort in a way I couldn't when I was 23. So yeah, I mean, there really isn't a good answer for it because the consequences are so very real. And they can fire you like that, especially in states that now have laws against this stuff. It's just really tough and it's really personal. I really struggle with like what people are so afraid of.
Yeah, and Paul, I recently had a guest on, Tricia Friedman from Shifting Schools, who was also talking about ways that we can make schools more inclusive, not only for our LGBTQ plus students, but also for staff. So for folks listening, for those folks whose story Paul's story is resonating with, do also check out what Tricia was talking about in this regard. Paul, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for your time. But before we go, can you tell folks where to find you?
Sure. So you can go to my website, maketeachingsustainable.org. It's where you can just learn more about the project, learn more about me and what I do. There's a blog on there that I really try to post to monthly, which doesn't always happen. I'm also on Twitter and on Instagram at Sustain Teaching. And it's another place where I trying to put out ideas as often as I can. And yeah, that's where you can find me. And then you can also check out my books. I'm published through ASCD, and that book is called Make Teaching Sustainable. And then I also have a few books published with Corwin Press, the latest of which is Reclaiming Personalized Learning. And there's a lot of similarities between the sustainable teaching and personalized learning books, because a lot of people have incorrect assumptions about personalized learning that make it unsustainable. And so the goal with that book is to really look at how do we humanize teaching to make it personally relevant to kids in a sustainable way. So thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I love that, Paul. Thank you so much for coming today. I appreciate this.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening today. I hope you got some great tips that you can bring back into your teaching. Remember, have a life teaching without sacrificing your own. Also, don't forget to subscribe and be well.